Hi, this is Beverly from scrapandthread.blogspot.com. Today I wanted to share some tips with you about binding mini books in maybe some non-traditional ways. There are some very nice tools on the market to be able to bind books, but sometimes maybe you want a different look, or maybe you don't have one of those tools. So I'm going to give you some suggestions for things to think about when you're binding and some materials that you can use to bind books. Sometimes you may get a kit and the book may come with these binding rings. And these are great, but one of the things to think about is whether or not, once you've loaded up your book, whether or not these will work for you. You can always get larger sized rings if you need to change them out. And then I like to decorate mine with tying bows or little ribbons on here. Sometimes I have some fibers or whatever hanging down, and that kind of just adds another little element, or maybe some tags or something also. Just tie them on there. And then other times it may look like a book is bound with ribbon, but in fact that may be just a design element, and in this case that is exactly what it is. So this was all glued together, and then there were holes punched and the ribbon was run through, but it's not holding the book together. The book is actually separately bound on one side, and then the page is open, but there's no movement on the actual binding. And that brings me to the next type of binding, which is if you use some kind of a fiber or a ribbon or something that you're going to make two or more holes on your book, and then use it as one unit to bind it. And you can use lots of different things. Here I have a ribbon. You can use pipe cleaners. You can use, this is the plastic paper, it's supposed to be paper raffia, but it's actually plastic raffia. Making like braided friendship bracelet type things, you can run those through the holes. Other pearl cotton, yarn, shoelaces. Just anything, use your imagination and use what you like and what you might have on hand. I've used twine before, pieces of twill, and pretty much every single kind of ribbon under the sun. There's something called waxy flax, also jute or hemp works really nicely. But one of the things to think about when you're doing this is the strength of your paper and whether or not it will support the type of item that you're going to be using to bind it. If it's something that's likely to cut into your papers, like if you use jewelry wire or some other kind of coated wire, it may end up cutting through regular paper. If you're using chipboard or a very, very thick cardstock, then that may not be an issue. But these are kinds of the things to think about when you're choosing what your materials are going to be. Another thing to think about is if you want this to be bound as one unit, or if you want these to act independently. The nice thing about the rings is that it doesn't really matter how tight you make it. I mean, it's not an issue of tightness because these will work independently and the pages will still turn as long as your rings are big enough. But with anything like this, where you would tie it as one unit, you do need to think in terms of whether or not it's going to impede the openability of it. And one of the things that a lot of people do when they're first making their mini books, or it's new to them, is they tie their ribbon on and they make it nice, like a nice little bow, and they don't realize that then it makes it hard to open the book and it impedes its ability to lay flat. Now, if you don't mind it not laying flat, that's not an issue. But if you want it to be able to lay flat or make sure that it does open, then you want to make sure you leave enough give in there to make sure that you've got space in there. The other thing is, if you bind your book before you filled it, it's quite likely that it will take up more space once it's filled. The space between the pages will take up more space. And so you may want to think about trying to plan in having a little bit of leeway there. And so what I usually do when I'm planning out my books and I have my my ribbon in or whatever it is I'm using, I will usually do some practice, not knots, but I will put my ribbon through, and then I will make sure that I'm able to open all of my pages so that they lay flat, and that gives me the knowledge about whether or not I've left enough leeway in there so that I can have some room for growth. And then, so what that ends up looking like when it's finished is that it may have a big gap in the back here, or in the front, or in the middle, however you put it. But realize that you need that if you want it to be able to open completely. Now, some books you may design where you don't want it to open completely, and of course then you would adjust your materials for that. If you have a regular hole punch that you get at the office supply store, and you want to make sure you line up your holes exactly where you want them, usually what I do is I'll make either a template out of just a piece of scratch paper, and then I know where my holes are, and I make the first set of holes, and then I put that over the other piece of paper, and then so I already have the ready-made holes there, and then I'll punch it again and do the same thing for both sides, and do that individually with each piece of paper or each piece of chipboard or whatever it is I'm working with. And then that way I'm assured of having them line up the way I want them to. And also, you know, if you, in the instance of this came punched with holes because I used the Cricut machine to cut out my papers. But sometimes even with that, you may not have your holes be completely lined up correctly if you've made some adjustments to the sizes, and maybe you have some bigger and some smaller pages, and in which case you may have to rearrange your holes. If you have any questions or comments, please visit my blog. This is Beverly, and I'm at scrapandthread.blogspot.com. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.